This is the Ted Wallison Podcast. Brought to you by Hollanders, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortinos, and Foodland locations. Hollanders, the way sausage should taste. And Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted Wallison.
My special guest this week is film critic for CTV. He's also a host of the podcast Last Call with Richard Crouse, and he is a writer with the Toronto Star. Welcome, the pride of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, Richard Crouse. How are you, Richard?
I'm good, Ted. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, it sounds like a postcard kind of place, picture postcard kind of place. Is it?
It is. Now, I grew up in Liverpool, so I was born in Bridgewater,
right.
In the hospital that is now, I think, the nurses' quarters. I think that's where, it's like a dormitory now, but it was the old hospital. Then when I was about 2 years old, we moved to Liverpool, Nova Scotia, and that's really where I grew up, and that is a picture-perfect little postcard town. It is relatively small, but there was a time around the turn of the last century when they thought that Liverpool was going to turn into something. It was going to be a big town. It's going to be the new Boston. It's going to be this port city that everyone's going to want to be in. So they built an opera house, and there was a vaudeville house, and a big town hall. And then none of the other development really happened. There was a hotel that had a dining room that seated hundreds of people. And then eventually the town when I lived there had about 1,500 people in it. So you could almost put the entire population of the town in the local movie theater. So it was this funny little town that had all these cool amenities, but was still very much a small, very old, picturesque town. There's gravestones in the main cemetery from 1620s. Wow. So, people being there for a long time had high hopes for the town, but it never became the port city that everyone thought it might.
So when you were starting to date, did you used to try to con women by telling them that you were from Liverpool, as in, I may or may not know the Beatles?
Well, no, the interesting thing is there's a Mersey River that runs right through the middle of Liverpool, Nova Scotia.
That's interesting.
And a lot of people that were the original settlers were from Liverpool, England, the other Liverpool, as we like to call it. But it was an interesting place. The building that I grew up in, my dad owned a furniture store, and the building that I grew up in was originally built as a vaudeville theater. And it operated as that for a little while until, of course, the town didn't take off. Then it turned into a lumber mill for a very long time. And then it turned into a furniture store. So it was this giant building that had a 2-level furniture store on the first 2 levels. And then we had a giant apartment on top of that. So I literally grew up in this store. But the interesting part of growing up there was that the back part of it, which was where the warehouses were and where everything, all the fridges and big appliances and furniture were kept, there was still a stage back there where the vaudeville theater had once been. So I literally grew up in a theater.
In the theater. Yeah, that's very cool. And you started in the industry at a very young age, 16 years of age. You're a disc jockey at radio station CKBW. Where is that located in Nova Scotia?
That's in Bridgewater. That was, and it was the radio station along the South Shore. It was the only one. Everybody listened to it, and I grew up listening to it, and I always wanted to be part of it. And so I just made a nuisance of myself until eventually one day at 16, I've sounded pretty much like this when I was 16 years old. I was brought in by a guy called Bob McLaren and given the job of, well, first of all, they trained me forever. So I went through a real apprenticeship there. And then I did country music shifts on the weekends. I did late night rock and roll shows. I read obituaries. Sometimes I did something called swap shop, where people would call in and say, I've got a baby carriage. It only has 3 wheels, but I still, I think it's worth a bit of money. I'd like to get $5 for it. So I did all those kind of shows, all that kind of small town radio stuff, until I got fired. And he was correct. Bob McLaren was correct to fire me. I wasn't particularly good at it. And he told me something the day that he fired me that has stayed with me ever since. He said, you've got the voice, you know the music that we're playing, but he said, we don't know who you are. In between songs, all you ever talk about are the Rolling Stones had 10 number 1 hits and all the trivia that I could spout out. And he said, people want to hear about you. And the thing that he said that has stuck with me throughout all these years was, people want to hear about people. Mm-hmm. And it seems so simple, absolutely the simplest rule ever, but it has stayed with me ever since. So every interview that I do, every show that I've ever produced, everything, it's always boiled down to the people and the personalities. We can talk about, other stuff, especially when you're doing movie interviews. What's it like to kiss Angelina Jolie? All those kind of questions. They don't mean a hill of beans unless you know the person that you're interviewing. And so I've kept that as my mantra ever since that day he fired me. I was devastated, but he was right to do it.
And the interesting thing is, you could almost, if you've got the chops, if you know what you're doing as an interviewer, you could literally, I believe, go out to the parking lot of a plaza, grab anybody there, bring them in, and warm them up for 5 minutes, and for sure you'll get a good interview out of them, because everybody has at least 1 or 2 good stories about their lives.
Everyone's got amazing stories, and you just have to find them. And so I do a lot of research when I start to interview someone.
Yeah, you can tell.
Yeah, and so I just interviewed a woman named Chloe Takos, and she is an actor who was on a show called The Righteous Gemstones, and she's made a bunch of movies. And it was pitched to me as, Gloria Freeman from the Righteous Gemstones. I like that show, so I picked it up. I said I would do the interview, and then I started doing the research. And she's fascinating. Born in Zimbabwe under the Robert Mugabe years, she eventually ended up making a documentary that was very anti-Mugabe, and her family had to leave Zimbabwe because they would have been thrown in jail because of this documentary that she made. This is about as far away from a comedy series on as you could possibly get. Yeah. But the stories were fascinating, and you just have to mine those stories. Everyone's got something that is unique and personal and makes them special.
I found it really interesting, and I did my research about you, the fact that you worked for years as a bartender, a time that you really enjoyed, mm-hmm. and you said it made you a better interviewer. Being a bartender.
Absolutely it did. Yeah. Well, being a bartender is different than being a waiter.
Yeah.
You have to share some of the same skills, but I spent most of my restaurant career, and it was a long time, it was like 17 years working in restaurants. I spent most of that time standing behind a bar, and when you're a bartender, you've got the thing that the people want. You've got the booze, you've got the drinks, and so your dynamic is a little different than it is if you're a waiter at a table. But what I found was, as a bartender, because you are serving people alcohol, you have to be very aware of, people's moods, how they're feeling, you have to anticipate what they're going to do next. You have to learn how to talk to people at all stages of the evening. So at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's easy to talk to people. It gets a little harder around 11 o'clock when everyone's drunk and you're the only sober person behind the bar. But it does teach you a great deal, and it also teaches you that thing that everyone's got a cool story. You just have to ask them about it, and people often want to be asked about themselves. So yeah, bartending was invaluable to me in terms of learning how to interview people.
So you will probably be the best interviewer on radio or television right now in terms of dealing with a drunk interviewee. Now, have you ever interviewed anybody who was drunk at the time?
Yeah, probably. When you cover film festivals in the way that I have, and you do red carpets at parties and that kind of thing. Absolutely, I can't think of any names right off the top of my head, but the name Nick Nolte runs through my brain a little bit as someone who was probably not quite in their formal state of mind when I did an interview with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. People would be surprised how many people maybe they wouldn't be surprised, but the amount of people who have battled alcohol and drugs in the entertainment industry. And I just read yesterday or today about Paul Williams, who admitted that the entire decade of the 80s was just a blackout for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's any number of reasons for that. I love a quote from Bruce Springsteen where he says, you don't go into this line of business because you had a normal childhood. you go into rock and roll or whatever it might be, acting and show business, because you had perhaps an unconventional time, or there was abuse, or there was something. I mean, it's not true for everybody, but for a lot of people, they're pushed towards the performing arts for deep-seated reasons. And I think that, if you do become successful, or maybe even if you don't, but if you become successful, people stop saying no to you as much, and people, are willing to indulge your behavior in no matter what it might be, because you're successful, you're rich, you're famous. They want to be along for the ride. It's one long party until it isn't. And I think that's probably, so often, I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people about this kind of thing, about the what happens when money is no longer an object, and you can do pretty much whatever you want to, and it's just it's a road to nowhere for a lot of people, and for some reason in the entertainment business, when you have lots of money and often a fair amount of spare time, if you're only making 2 movies a year, you've got a bit of downtime. There's distractions out there, and they're not always healthy ones.
And it'd be interesting if we could all have the ability to see into the future, to know what it'd be like to, when you're riding a high and you've just released 5 hit albums or 5 hit films back to back to back to back. Suddenly, it doesn't happen anymore, and now you're treated as a different individual. How much different those people would be on the way up.
Absolutely, and it's interesting. When you're at film festivals, so people arrive with entourages quite often. Yeah. So and I find it's newer stars that will arrive with 5 people in tow, and someone with snacks, and someone whose only job it is to open a bottle of water for the actor should they want one. There's always these entourages. Who doesn't have the entourages are giant stars from years ago, because they realize that it's just sort of an empty gesture. You don't need it. You don't have to prove anything by having, this big group of people in tow everywhere that you go. So, often the older stars are the coolest. Michael Caine, when he's come to the Toronto International Film Festival, they'll say, "Hey, well, Michael, we'll send a car for you." He was like, "I've been to Toronto before. I've shot movies there. I don't need a car. I'll get one at the airport, and I'll make my way downtown. I can find the hotel." And that's kind of old school, I think, and I like that. I appreciate that.
Snoop Dogg just admitted recently that he pays some guy $50,000 a year to roll joints for him.
Oh, listen,
nice gig.
Well, there are some things like, Samuel L. Jackson told me one time that his best friend comes along with him to press junkets and on sets and that kind of thing as his hairdresser. The funny part of that is he's bald. He doesn't have a hair on his head. Yeah, so this guy is being paid by the studio. I don't think Sam Jackson's paying him. I think that the studio is probably paying him just so that, Samuel Jackson has his best friend with him and probably feels more comfortable, and it's money well spent.
Richard Crouse is my guest. He is the film critic for CTV. He's also a writer for the Toronto Star. He's got his own podcast. He works on the radio. He's got a radio program. He's all over the map here, in a good way. Let's go back, because we talked about how you started in the business, working in radio as a young age. What happened after that? You started writing?
I did. I'd always wanted to be a writer, and so I kind of felt that there was this kind of conundrum that you couldn't get published until you had already been published. And you couldn't get published until people knew who you were. So shortly after leaving CKBW, being escorted out of CKBW, who, by the way, that was, so years later, after CKBW, I was in Los Angeles working, and I interviewed Donald Sutherland. And we were sitting there for TV doing the interview, and a light blew. And so the whole thing is useless. We're going to have to start all over again. It's going to take a few minutes to fix the light bulb. And Donald Sutherland is unhappy at this situation. He's not pleased about it. And I thought I was going to lose the interview and it was all going to go south. So I said, you and I, Donald Sutherland, have something in common. We both worked at CKBW Radio. He grew up on the East Coast. And he did the same thing that I did, only a little bit more extreme. He told me the story about how he grew up listening to that radio station, much like I did. And he went down to the station every day when the announcers were getting off the air. So you knew at 2 o'clock, the mid-morning guy would probably be done. Yep. And so he'd be leaving. So Donald Sutherland would wait in the parking lot and say, hey, my name's Donald. I'd really love to work there. And he just did this for weeks and maybe months until finally someone invited him in. And he was the junior announcer there, 30 years probably before I was. And he stayed there, as long as he was in the Maritimes, and then, moved to New York and then Hollywood after that. But we shared that same job. And he used it as a stepping stone, much like I tried to. But I realized when I moved to Toronto, having been fired from a small station in Nova Scotia, didn't mean that people were going to be lining up to hire me. So I tried
oddly enough
everything I could. Yeah, I tried a lot of different things to get on the radio, and some worked, some didn't. I did some freelance work here and there. Ended up on CBC Radio on the morning side with Peter Zosky as their pop culture expert for some time. I did a show with Catherine O'Hara called Later the Same Day that I was on. She was the host. And so I did a lot of that stuff because I wanted to be a writer. But as I said, people didn't know who I was, so I had to try and find a way to get my name around a little bit. And it worked. The CBC stuff in particular led to my first book deal with Doubleday. And it was because I was on Morningside. And I remember the publisher of Doubleday at the time saying, Morningside sells books. So write this book for us. And, the first time Peter Zosky introduces me after the book is out as Richard Crouse, author of ... That book is going to sell. And it did. It worked. And that was the beginning of getting my stories in book form published. I published a little bit here and there before that, but the books really took off because of the radio connection.
And you've written 11 books? To date?
I've written 11 books and then parts of lots of other books, anthologies and things. Right. But yeah, I've written 11 books. One of them, I wrote a book called Raising Hell, Ken Russell and the Unmaking of the Devils, which is the story of one of the most controversial movies ever made. It's called The Devils, released in 1971, starred Oliver Reed, Vanessa Redgrave. And I did that book 8 years ago, I think, 8 or 9 years ago. Came out, it did very well, sold all over the world. People were very happy with it. And it's coming out at the end of this month in a new French edition that will be available all over Europe. And it's beautiful. They've done a really great job of the translation and the cover and the whole thing. So, yeah, the French translation of the book that I wrote 8 or 9 years ago is coming out. And, when you get the check for that, it's kind of fun because it's. They always say when you're a writer, you're trying to make money while you sleep. You want those books to be selling. You want that thing, and that was an example of making money while I slept. It was just one day I got an offer. I said yes, and then a check arrives with a box of books, and it was a good day.
Yeah. Well, what excites you the most? The fact that there's a new film, a new television program, a new CD about to be released. Which of those things grabs your attention the most?
I think probably movies, although music has always been a great love of mine. I wrote about music for years before I ever wrote anything about film, mostly because no one would pay me to write about film and people would pay me to write about music. But I knew a great deal about it. And so if there's something new that grabs my ear, then that's very exciting. A new song, if I'm out somewhere, because in the old days I used to go to Sam the Record Man and I would just buy whatever was new coming in that sort of looked cool. Records were $3.99, $4.99, $5.99, whatever. Yeah. I'd grab a handful of records. and test them out, give them a test spin, and if I didn't like them, I'd sell them at a secondhand store, and then go back to Sam's and buy more new stuff. And but it doesn't happen so much that way for me anymore. Spotify and all those things have kind of taken some of the fun out of that for me, because they tend to. It's an algorithm, and so they look at what you already like, and then they just give you more of stuff that they figure you're going to like. I want to be challenged a little bit. I want to be pushed around a little bit, and have my wings spread open a little bit more than that. So Spotify hasn't been, even though it's every song ever recorded. That's not true, but essentially everything you might want is going to be there. I find it kind of. It's not as much fun as going down to Sam the Record Man and saying to the person working behind the counter, "Hey, what's new?" and finding something new and exciting that way.
Yeah, you touched very briefly, I think, on Twitter about the upcoming release of the film Elvis, which you seem to be pretty excited about.
Yeah, well, I grew up listening to Elvis because family members did. Elvis was never really my music; it was just before me a little bit. And but I loved the '68 comeback special. I was a very small kid when that was on, but that seemed really exciting to me, and that's recreated in a really kind of vivid way in the new movie, the new Baz Luhrmann movie Elvis, and it's Elvis Presley is someone who I think is endlessly fascinating to people, because he was only famous really for about 20 years, somewhere in and around there. It was just a couple of decades. And in that couple of decades, there's all these very distinct phases of his career, and the music sounds different from phase to phase. The early rock and roll has really nothing much to do with the Vegas stuff that he was playing. There's a little bit of protest music in the middle there with songs like "If I Could Dream." So you've got a fascinating career. Marred by, in some ways, I think, nurtured by and marred by Colonel Tom Parker, who, treated Elvis like a golden ATM machine. As long as he was making money, he didn't really care what the product was. And so I think you've got someone who reached the very heights of fame and, in some ways really changed the way we listen to music. And then on the other hand, you've got a story of unfulfilled ambition, because Elvis could have been, I think, a great actor had he made, for instance, A Star Is Born with Barbra Streisand, which was originally supposed to happen, but the Colonel didn't like Barbra Streisand didn't like the Colonel, and the Colonel didn't like the money he was being offered. But if he had been given more opportunities to make movies like King Creole and some of the others that actually showed his dramatic chops, I think he might have had a very different career. Yeah. And so people are interested in that. And the movie Elvis essays a lot of that. It's quick because, it's 2.5 hours long, and it breezes over a lot of stuff, though, because there are just so many things to talk about. So it starts when Elvis is a kid, ends in the Vegas years, and in between is typical Baz Luhrmann film. It's flashy and gaudy and exciting to watch, and the soundtrack is really interesting. They've taken the songs and kind of tweaked them a little bit, and you've got this guy called Austin Butler who's 22, 23 years old, who is playing Elvis. And, he was a Disney star when he was a kid. I saw him on Broadway 3 or 4 years ago with Denzel Washington doing The Iceman Cometh. So he's got some acting chops, and he plays Elvis. And I think when that movie opens, it's going to change his life. It's going to make him a very big star.
Yeah. There are certain films that I've seen in my life that even when they show up on television now and on the various channels, that even if I've seen it a dozen times, like The Godfather will get me at 11 o'clock at night. It's The Godfather 2, and it just started, and I'm thinking, no, Ted, don't watch this. Don't watch this. Yeah. Next thing I know, it's 3:45. I'm going to sleep because it just ended. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it is. Are there films like that you can't turn away from, even after seeing it for a dozen times?
Yeah, The Godfather is one of them. And a little while ago, we were kicking around that. Number one, unlike most people, I like number one more than number two. Number two is great. Do not get me wrong. It's a great film, but I'm a real fan of number one. Uh-huh. And if it's on television, I always say, I'll stay. If it's on television, I always say, I'm going to sit here and watch it just up until the leave the gun, take the cannoli scene. Of course, I end up watching the entire thing past that. Because it's so great. A little while ago, we're kicking around here, And it's on television, so we're going through it. And my wife is on her phone, and she says, the movie is playing down at a theater just around the corner from us. Turn off the TV, go down, and sat and watched it on the big screen. And it's a much different movie on the big screen. It is, you see the beautiful cinematography. You see in a way that you just don't see it on television. You see the subtleties in Marlon Brando's performance. If you can, see this on the big screen, because it's a revelation after years of having watched it on television.
Yeah, you know what? I've been watching a lot of different kinds of television. Introduced to me by my son and my son's friends who are in their young and mid 30s, and I stumbled upon a show about a year or so ago called "What We Do in the Shadows."
That's great.
Which is about vampires. And when I first started watching it, the first 10 minutes of it I watched, I thought, what the hell am I watching? This is so bizarre. And now I can't wait. Is it coming back?
It is coming back.
Good.
Taika Waititi, who is one of the producers, directors, and writers on that, is about the hottest comedy and anything else director in the world right now. And so I think his involvement with the Marvel Universe, he directs the Thor movies now, might have slowed down the next season, and COVID probably had something to do with it. Might have slowed down the next season, but I understand it's coming back. I can't wait. It's a fantastic show. It's about
vampires
who are petty and kind of terrible people,
yes.
and
they are.
It's not that kind of like sexy Dracula sort of coming to my parlor kind of vampire. These are much different, and things go wrong frequently for them, and they're living in modern day. It's a fantastic show, and one that really bears up to binging. They're only about half an hour long, and I always end up getting sucked in and watching 4 or 5 of them in a row.
Yeah. You know what else I quite enjoyed? It was a short run. I think they just did 6 episodes so far. It was Shoresy, which is the same people who brought you Letterkenny.
The Letterkenny show, it's the hockey. It's the sort of the offshoot of a character that originated on Letterkenny. Right. Letterkenny is so popular. It's such a success story, and I'm so happy for them, because it was something that started off, I think, as a short film, and then they decided to make it into a web series. It went to TV, and it's done so well for them. And I love that the one of the writers and director, whose name is escaping me right now, once told me, though, he said, "We think of this as like drunk Harold Pinter." So, interesting dialogue, but just twisted by a couple of Labatt 50s. So I like that. I'm very happy for the success of those guys.
A friend asked me to ask you. He says, "Ask Richard if he thinks that with the new Star Trek programs, is Star Trek oversaturated on television?"
It's a funny thing, because for me it feels like a lot of that science fiction franchise stuff, whether it's Star Trek or any of the others, that tend to have spin-off shows. And Star Trek, man, there's a cartoon series, there's a couple of live action ones, and I for me it feels oversaturated. But for real fans, I don't think that you can have enough of it for them. Mm-hmm. And just look at the success of all the spin-offs of Star Wars. You've got Obi-Wan, and you've got The Mandalorian and the Clone Wars. I mean, it just goes on and on. Plus all the movies that were coming out there for a while. It was a movie a year for a little while, a few years ago before the pandemic. So, I think the fans are up for it. I do think, though, that there is a danger of alienating people after a little while. It's like it's too much. It's not special anymore just because there's too much of it. But the new Star Trek series kind of feels to me like a throwback to the original. And I think that people are really enjoying that. I think they're enjoying the return to Gene Roddenberry's vision, and the idea that these stories they're not simpler, but they morally, I think that they have a lot more to do with what Roddenberry had in mind initially, and they've taken away some of the grit that they threw at some of the other series.
More of the Ted Wallisham podcast after this.
Hey, let me take a moment to tell you about my friends at Hollanders. They are the meat people. You know, I've been a fan of their products for years now, and without a doubt, they make some of the best sausage in Ontario. They are multiple award winners, having captured the Ontario's finest meat competition's coveted Award of Excellence on 3 occasions, in addition to dozens of individual product awards. Hollanders has also received the Grand Champion ribbon at the past 2 Royal Winter Fairs ready-to-eat meat snack competitions. So whether you're preparing a charcuterie board or a full-blown sit-down dinner for your friends or family, you'll find Hollanders' award-winning products at fine meat shops throughout the province, now including selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortinos, and Foodland stores, along with their 7 Hollanders locations. Their barbecued kielbasa is my favorite. On a fresh bun with horseradish, it is out of this world. But don't just take my word for it. Judge for yourself. On your barbecue, in your kitchen, or straight from the refrigerator. Hollanders, the way sausage should taste. June is birthday month at Tom's Place, so come celebrate Tom's 66th birthday on June 7th, and that's today is June 9th, and finally, Tom Jr.'s is on the 13th. Throw in Father's Day and Canada Day, and you've got a month-long party, and we know how to celebrate with great birthday deals like 100% wool suits from $166 to $266, selected dress pants and shirts for $66, and selected sports jackets starting at $166. Wish Tom happy birthday on Facebook for a chance to win a $660 shopping spree. Tom's Place will suit you.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
Richard Crouse is an author. He's a radio broadcaster, television broadcaster, podcast host as well. We're chatting about a number of different things here. Your thoughts on Westworld?
I don't understand it. I've tried. I thought that the original movie, which isn't great, but it is great as viewed through my 14-year-old lens. When I first saw it, I was 13 or 14 years old. And the idea of like these robots that look like Yul Brynner and this place where you could go where there were all these different worlds that you could inhabit and stuff was very exciting to me. And so I have very fond memories that probably outshine the quality of the actual movie itself. But I have very fond memories of the original movie. So I was excited about the new series. And it has lost me in just this cavalcade of ideas and unresolved storylines and things. Maybe I just haven't given it my full attention, and I think a show like that you have to. But for me, it's a little bit trying to sit through.
What am I not watching on television that I should be watching?
You should be watching Hacks. If you haven't seen Hacks, Gene Smart, the great Gene Smart, plays a comedian who is kind of like Joan Rivers, something like that. Or she has a residency in Las Vegas, which is about to come to an end after 30 years. So she knows she has to freshen up her act. So she hires a much younger comedian played by Hannah Einberger, who's Lorraine Newman's daughter, and in real life. Yeah, and from Saturday Night Live. And she comes in, and typically, both their worlds are turned upside down. But it's smart. It's funny. The performances are great. Gene Smart won an Emmy, I think, last year for the first season. I anticipate that everyone involved in this show will be nominated for Emmys this coming season. The season 2 is already up on Crave. You can have a look at it there. It's fantastic. And it's just really, really good television, really well-written, smart, but above all, funny television that's completely character-driven. And when you've got great actors like that, that's enough for me.
For me, as a consumer of television, what I admire the most about television, I don't even know if it's the acting. I think it's the script writing that does it for me, which is why I was always a big fan of MASH, because the writing was brilliant. Aaron Sorkin's West Wing was outstanding, the writing in that. And Frasier, which is set for a comeback. And people talk to me about Frasier and Seinfeld and say, well, Seinfeld's funnier. And I said, the writing isn't nearly as good on Seinfeld as it is on Frasier.
I'll tell you, I guess I'll agree with you. I mean, they're different. They're like, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. But Frasier was always, when my wife couldn't sleep, we'd throw on an episode of Frasier, and by the time the end credits said tossed salad and scrambled eggs, by the time the beginning credits had ended, she was asleep. For some reason, it was like a Valium for her.
Yeah.
But then over the pandemic, we decided that we would give it a serious go, and one of the streaming services had all the episodes, and it's a lot of episodes. It's 200 and however many, 260 episodes or something. And we watched all of them, and it is fantastic. The characters, the writing, the acting, the situations, there is a real mix of like poignant moments mixed with slapstick, mixed with great character work. Yeah. Frasier is a great show, and it's coming back, but apparently like David Hyde Pierce isn't involved in it, and that's not good, because what's Frasier without Niles, his brother, character? And Daphne Moon, the Jane Leeves, who plays her, is on a show called The Resident. So is she coming back? I don't know. So I would need, I don't know. There's a part of the nostalgia that I have for it suggests that maybe I wouldn't mind having a look at it, but I'm not really sure that if it doesn't have all the elements I want, that it's going to be all that satisfying for me.
Yeah. What do I need to see on the big screen right now, other than The Godfather?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, there's a movie coming out in about a week and a half or 2 weeks. I don't know when this will air, but soon, called Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. And so Marcel is a character that's been kicking around for a while online. There were some YouTube videos made, and Marcel is literally a mollusk that has one big googly eye and a little pair of feet, a little pair of shoes. And it's voiced by Jenny Slate, the comedian Jenny Slate. And Marcel is just curious about the world. And that's what the shorts didn't have that much plotting to them. It was just more about this interesting little character that lives. Mm-hmm. So they made a movie, and I wasn't really sure if they were going to be able to stretch this out to 90 minutes or not. And to my delight, this is one of the best movies I've seen this year. And it is the story of Marcel the Shell, this little mollusk who lives in an Airbnb. He's lived there for years. But when the people moved out of the Airbnb, they inadvertently took his family with them. And so he's on the search to find his family. And it's poignant, it's smart, it's funny. I saw it with an audience of film critics who are the most jaded, awful people in the world. And people were laughing hysterically and wiping tears away from their eyes simultaneously. It's really great. And it's an offbeat thing. It's called Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, and it's worth a look.
I'll keep my eyes open for that. You mentioned streaming, and let's talk a little bit, if we can. Richard Crouse is my guest, about the streaming wars that are going on here. How's that all going to end? I mean, we're going to get to a point where we pay for everything we watch on television?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, much like we used to when everyone cut the cord and decided to move over to streaming. But what's happening is, and I predicted this a number of years ago, when Disney bought up 20th Century Fox, and they started buying catalogs. Yeah. And I thought they're looking towards making a run at Netflix. And sure enough, Disney Plus comes along and has been very successful. But what's happening is, in the States, there's Peacock, which is Warner Brothers, or an NBC.
NBC, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's Warner Brothers has one. Everyone will eventually have their own streaming service, and everyone is going to have content that is specific to that streaming service. So let's just say that you're a huge Seinfeld fan, and you want to watch Seinfeld. Well, I think in Canada, Crave has the rights for Seinfeld now. I might be wrong about that, but I think they do. So that's where you have to go. So if you're a Seinfeld fan, you're going to have that. But if you also want to watch What We Do in the Shadows, well, that's only on Disney Plus. So you're going to have Disney Plus, and then you're only going to get something on Netflix, Bridgerton, if you're a Bridgerton fan. So you're going to be paying for individual services, and it's going to get expensive. And I'm not sure exactly what will happen. Netflix has had kind of a reckoning moment recently where, their spend like drunken sailor days seem to be over because, they'd give Martin Scorsese $250 million to make a movie that every other studio in Hollywood had turned down. Turns out it was a great movie, but it's not a movie that traditional Hollywood probably would have financed because they didn't see a way to make money with it. Instead, Netflix says, we just want eyeballs and we want prestige and we want to be known as a place that's really friendly to auteur filmmakers. And so they I don't know, recklessly, but they spent. And now they seem to be reeling back. I think we're going to see fewer movies. I think instead of them financing two $10 million budgeted movies, they'll just make one $20 million movie, make it a little bigger, a little splashier, maybe have a bigger star or something in it. But I don't think we're going to see the constant stream of new material that we've been seeing. But that's kind of what streaming audiences demand. If you go to the homepage of any of your streamers and there's nothing new on it, you're like, well, what am I paying for this for? I want constant, rotation of information and content for me. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years for the streamers, and we'll see. My fingers are crossed because I think that the streamers are providing a real golden age in television right now. There are great shows out there,
Yeah, there are.
and I love that there's an older back catalog you can find. If you want to see Dog Day Afternoon, you can find it somewhere on one of the streamers, and I love that.
But it's interesting. I have conversations with people, and they say to me, you got to see this show. It's on Netflix or it's on Peacock or wherever it happens to be streaming. And I said, no, I haven't seen it. And they look at me like I just fell off a fruit truck out in the country somewhere.
There's too
What do you mean you haven't seen that? Well, because there's 8,465 television shows on right now. And then I suggest the show, and they go, I've never heard of it. I don't know what you're talking about it. And there are actors out there right now making a living that nobody has ever heard of, and they're making a living, and they will for the rest of their lives.
I love, it's Mark Maron, I think, has this joke about, it used to be, 25 years ago, you'd say, hey, I got a new show on NBC, and everybody knew about it.
Yeah.
Now you go and say, hey, I got a new show, and the first question is, where's it streaming? And then the second question is, like, what's that? Because there are so many streaming services out there. So it can be hard to find stuff sometimes. And it's great because content creators are getting a chance to actually create great content, and actors are working and shows are being made and stories are being told. And I think during the pandemic, we learned the importance of all that. As most of us were locked up at home, we turned to the streamers, we turned to artists, musicians and things. We watched Zoom comedy shows. The streamers gave us this blast of nostalgia that seemed to be very popular during the pandemic. People were looking around in the rest of the world, seeing how messed up it was out there and saying, you know what, I'm going to watch Seinfeld, or I'm going to watch Frasier, or I'm going to watch one of these comfort food shows because it just makes me feel better. The nostalgia of it makes me feel better, reminds me of a better time, or, these are characters I feel like I really know and really want to spend time with. So we realize the importance that the arts has in all of our lives. And the streamers are, in a lot of ways, really responsible for that because they gave us an opportunity to be invited into their world while our world was locked down. And that's important.
Look what's happened to the world of what I call cooks and carpenters. I mean, there's how many hundreds of television shows, Battle of the Food, Baker's Wall, Chef's Wall. My God, all these different home improvements, flip this house, buy this house, sell this house, snakes in the house, whatever, And I've had some of these, and they've been great guests on my podcast, and I'll tell people I have so-and-so on, and some people say, oh, my God, I love that. I watch their show all the time. That's one of the greatest things in the world. And other people just look at me like, what are you talking about?
Oh, I will watch anyone build anything. And so...
and are you good at it? Are you a handyman?
I'm terrible at it.
Me too.
I am not. I am not. I have a box of tools untouched that occasionally the guy that I hired to come in and fix things, he'll use them, but I don't. But I will watch a show like Maine Cabin Masters, where they go to remote parts of Maine and fix up old cottages and things. I will binge that like nobody's business. Cooking shows, I like watching cooking shows. I can cook. I'm a pretty good cook, but I like watching people make things. I think that's just something that's kind of down in our DNA somewhere, and it's kind of aspirational. If you see someone cooking on television, you figure, well, maybe I could do that here as well. but also, they're set up like competition shows often, so there's a bit of excitement to them as well. But yeah, I wish I was a better cook. I wish I could swing a hammer a little better, because I'd probably have another television show right now.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me as well is I find it so ironic, because I enjoy cooking. I'm not good at it. I enjoy watching people build things, but I couldn't build a shoebox if I tried. Nope. And yet I'm addicted to both of these types of programs. It's really weird. Let's talk briefly about your podcast. Tell me what that's all about and where it's available. I'm assuming at all major podcast platforms.
It is available wherever you find podcasts. It's called Last Call with Richard Crouse.
Right.
And I made the first episodes of it during the worst part of the lockdown, when it didn't look like we were ever going to be able to step outside again without wearing a hazmat suit. And I thought, I'd love to go sit at a bar and have a beer somewhere. That just was the thing that the carrot dangling on the stick for me. And so I made a podcast that was all about virtually visiting the world's greatest bars. So I took you to Harry's New York bar in Paris, where they invented the Bloody Mary. My wife and I have sat there and watched the bartender make them. Like, it was like watching, Michelangelo carve something beautiful out of a block of marble. I mean, It was just incredible to see this bartender put together Bloody Marys in the same bar, in the same room where they were invented. So I tell you all about that place. I tell you about McSorley's Irish Ale House in New York City, where it's been there so long, Abraham Lincoln used to drink there. I tell you about all these other bars, Sardi's, also in New York, the legendary theater bar where my wife and I were married years ago. And so I take you around and I tell you the history of these places. I tell you a few stories about them. And then I interview someone who is directly connected to the place. So in the case of McSorley's, I interviewed the son of a bartender who worked there for 47 years. And they used to live upstairs. And when this young guy, when this person I interviewed, the son, was young, he used to go down and in the mornings on the weekends, he'd polish the brass and, do little odd jobs, and the regulars would throw some money at him. But he had incredible stories about this legendary bar that, everyone in New York City has walked through at some point. And the podcast just turned out to be a lot of fun. So it's on Apple and Spotify and all those places. And it's also available. If you just Google Last Call with Richard Crouse, it comes up on its own website as well.
This has been lots of fun, and I'd love to do this again, because there's just so much we could talk about. We could be here for weeks and weeks, but I know people have lives. So let's go back.
Well, thanks, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Oh, Richard, it's my pleasure. I look forward to hearing you on the radio and watching you on television, and I'm looking forward to checking out your podcast. Sounds fascinating. I appreciate it very much, taking the time. Let's do it again, seriously.
Absolutely.
The Ted Wallacham Podcast has been brought to you by Hollanders, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortinos, and Foodland locations. Hollanders, the way sausage should taste. And Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. The Ted Wallacham Podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.